When the wealthy merchant Sava Mamantov and members of his artistic circle walked into the recently purchased Aksakov family estate called Abramtseva, in the waning decades of the 19th century, they immediately realized they were stepping into another era. Fin de siècle merchants and artists like the Mamontovs and their circle understood that they had to show profound respect for the previous owners. Although he expanded the footprint of the house after purchasing it and created a new wing to accommodate his large family, he kept many objects, tables, dressers, chairs, where they were precisely, and did little to change the visual landscape. The past was, in this sense, everywhere. It was embedded in the domestic material objects, whether the furniture or the Aksakov old things, and it resided, quote, in a kind of spirit reflected in the Aksakov stories told by the servants whom Mamontov retained. And yet, even as elements of the former era continued to thrive, a new, young, energetic light, I'm quoting from a memoir here, emerged at the exact same time. So there were two time frames existing simultaneously at Abramtseva, this Aksakov then Mamontov estate. The spirits from the past were characters in the present, embedded as they were in the spaces and objects of the past, as Abramtsov entered into a new phase of its own. Time and the nostalgic temporal frame were part of the domestic interiors and ordinary objects of daily life. These two time frames, simultaneously experienced, reflect modern definitions of time. As the past collapsed in on and helped to define the present, predictable linear temporal notions did not sufficiently represent how modern turn-of-the-century Russians understood time, history, and memory. Rather than a forward, predictable path, fin de siècle time was imagined as heterogeneous, as we've heard already, and fluid. This heterogeneity included notions of rupture or irreversibility and layering, various eras simultaneously layered on top of one another. So everyone understood that there was no turning back the clock, not really, and that the past had become inherent in the present. Modern time, according to philosopher Reinhard Koselleck, was evident when, to quote him, people began to reflect on historical time itself. And the fin de siècle moment in Europe, as you all well know, brought with it new ideas about time and space. So in addition to the technological developments that transformed actual experiences of time and space on the ground, cultural changes, of course, were revolutionizing ways of perceiving and conceptualizing time and space across the cultural world. And as we've heard already, I'm sure in the panels today, simultaneity made its way into this world. Yet modern concepts rarely emerge seamlessly. So just as politicians, philosophers, scientists were imagining time mechanically transformed into a unifying concept, writers and artists rejected this impulse and embraced this concept of heterogeneity. For them, time was flux, a stream, and not a sum of discrete units. So the very mingling and clash of time frames and the belief that there was no going back marked, as we know, modernity, and was heightened at the end of the 20th century across Europe and, as I'll show, in Russia. So nostalgia. Nostalgia, with its backward gaze, emerges, I argue, out of these modern ideas of the fluid and heterogeneous nature of time. Although it's tempting to understand nostalgia as a bulwark against the passage of time and its inevitable change, such explanations, I think, miss the point. So I, too, quote Svetlana Boym, and I'm not sure we read her the same way, so it might be an interesting discussion. Nostalgia, Boym writes, is dependent on the modern conception of unrepeatable and irreversible time. And this notion of rupture, as well as layering, in other words, is, I'm saying, integral to the embrace of nostalgia. One can only reach for the past if one has a sense of the flow and rupture of human experiences in the past, present, and future. Nostalgia for Russian writers and readers had significant spatial dimensions as well. Nostalgia from Nostro's Return Home, Algia Longing, is a desire for a place, a home that no longer is around or in some instances never existed. It is a sentiment that includes both a sense of loss and displacement, while simultaneously reimagining what was lost and relocating that where it should have been. Nostalgia necessitates a sense of present and past, a kind of double exposure which becomes stifled within the conventional confines of time and space. Nostalgia in this sense is integral, is part of modern temporality with its insistence on irreversibility and the necessary recreation of the past. The past comes into view through its spatial dimensions and its material objects. Modern Russian subjects understood that they could never go back to the spaces of childhood, to the estates of their memory, or as I argue elsewhere, to this embrace of peasant handicrafts. They presented the texture of their past through portraits of the spaces fading or already gone, and descriptions of objects that allowed them to travel time in their memories. The timing of the appearance of nostalgic images and discourse was, of course, no accident. They emerged just as Russia was undergoing its rapid drive toward modernity. So in these final years of the Russian Tsarist regime, there were dramatic spatial transformations afoot. Movement and relocation were ubiquitous, whether temporary, seasonal, or permanent. Expressions of nostalgia for the places now left, a village, a town, or an estate, reflected an imagined, now vanished, past mixed with a rapidly changing environment where peasants became landlords and intelligentsia families fled. As a particular phenomenon of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Russian nostalgia exposed then not the past, but rather this fractured and modern present. So as Russians attempted to create and build new, more modern spaces, whether apartments or factories, they too desired at the same time the destruction of such places and the return of the past, a kind of time-space complex that was at once desired and unattainable. So the spaces highlighted in nostalgic writings of the era, thus, are not inconsequential. Living in an environment of uncertainty and change, Russian fin de siècle writers often situated their nostalgic portraits within the familial and familiar domain of the domestic sphere. As modern nostalgia mourned the loss of the possibility of return and the loss of a time more carefree, predictable, and orderly, writers and readers recreated the past through textual and visual signs where the domestic spaces signaled that mythical world. So for Russians living in these years, the nostalgic gaze existed, and this is a quote, somewhere in the twilight of the past or on the island of utopia where time has happily stopped as on an antique clock. So there's so many examples, so I've chosen just a few because of time. Pages upon pages of journals and memoirs written at the fin de siècle reified estate life at the very moment when it was receding from view. In these early 20th century pages, against the backdrop, of course, of war and revolution, the estate symbolized what had been lost, and as such simultaneously embodied a modern nostalgia and longing. This new modern understanding of the role of the estate represents a significant shift from what came before. So I can't help it, I'm a historian, so from what came before, which of course is an 18th century pastoral idyll, timeless and still. Of course, the 18th century pastoral never perfectly reflected the day-to-day realities of life on the estate, but it served as a central motif in writing, whether fictional or autobiographical, thank you, in the pre-emancipation era. For some writers of this earlier era, the estate represented a retreat from the demands of state service and from the superficiality of high society. Here on the estate, surrounded by portraits of family and overgrown gardens, noblemen dreamt of a return to their roots, to the stillness and predictability of country life. This impulse of retreat into the rural can be called, and has been called, a pastoral impulse. An important aspect of the pastoral impulse, in this temporal sense, is its embrace of old time, a kind of flattened version of the past. Bakhtin, who I'm afraid to mention in a room full of literary critics, but Bakhtin in his writings on chronotopes highlights how the blurring of all the temporal boundaries made possible by a unity of place also contributes in an essential way to the cyclical rhythmicalness, how do you say that? Rhythmicalness of time, so characteristic of the idyll. So it's a kind of rhythmic sense of time that marks the old time understanding of the circular rhythms of daily life. And it's precisely that I'm trying to argue transforms at the end of the century. By the fin de siècle, time was understood differently. Writers and readers in the early 20th century created this modern temporal ideal that reflected not the lives lived by earlier generations, but the desires and dreams of the writers and readers themselves in these years amidst significant change. Put differently, the phenomenon of modern nostalgia found its way into the pages of these fin de siècle publications, even at this point among political and military conflict, was not so much a longing for a real past as it was a function of the centrality of loss of an imagined past to the modern condition. Nostalgia, with its embracing of movement, change, rupture, reflected the modern circumstances of urbanization, mass production, political upheaval, and industrial change. Now, perhaps the starkest reflection of this modern temporal impulse, this nostalgic impulse, was the appearance of this really cool publication called Stolica I Usadba, or Capital City and Country House, which was published from 1913 to 1918. It was this kind of lifestyle magazine that, if I were more organized, I'd be showing you my PowerPoint, but it was a lifestyle magazine that recounted for, because it's beautiful, that recounted for readers the lost beauty of estate life. This lifestyle magazine chronicled this period with its layouts of these elite domestic spaces, social commentary, and sleek advertisements. It had articles on individual estates, portraits of weddings, photos of balls, as well as the occasional gussied-up dog. The audience for this glossy lifestyle magazine included the waning aristocracy and the emergent ambitious middle classes. Replete with elaborate covers and photographs to spare, it modeled itself on publications found in capital cities across Europe, including London, Berlin, Paris. In addition to the very famous photographs of society ladies, the writers and editors featured pictures and descriptions of ancient estates, as well as contemporary ones in each issue. Depictions of countless pre- and post-emancipation, as in 1861 peasants, estates, detailed in the pages of this glossy magazine, included winding garden passageways, tall ceilings, elaborate chandeliers, and antique clocks. So as we turn the pages, what emerges is an emphasis on not only the mixing of various artistic styles within domestic interiors, the layering of buildings to constitute the experience of prior generations, but also the fantasies of a modern age where the layers of the past collectively help to constitute the present. It's a mouthful. Appearing twice each month, Stolica I Usadba had as one of its explicit missions to preserve the past. That's a quote from the first issue. One of the ways in which Stolica did this was through the presentation of genealogical histories of the estates themselves, as well as their inhabitants. Authors paused on the changing of inhabitants and the renovating of structures as estates passed from one generation to the next. With each new set of occupants, aspects of the built environment and objects within the walls were transformed, whether improved or destroyed, reflecting this kind of progressive linear movement of time through domestic space. But at the same time, the narrative of occupancy and renovation or renewal of the built environment and the creation of a kind of pastiche of interior objects was neither straightforward nor predictable, nor always linear. The present, at least in the sections of the magazine that focus explicitly on the domestic interiors, is anchored in this desire to capture or create an imagined past. Yet the past is often imagined through a series of layered stories and vignettes indicating an embrace of modern historical time. Okay, I think I'm probably running out of that. So let me just go right to a few examples more specifically. So each issue contains a focus on one or another estate from the 18th or early 19th centuries. And in almost every issue, there's a section that's called literally Old and New Portraits. which allows the recounting of shifting ownership stories intermingled with the history of the physical transformation of the landscape and also of the buildings over time. We learn about the interior and exterior design of a particular historical state and its inhabitants. And I'm just going to give you two examples of estates, one from December 1913 in the magazine and one from 1916, which are rather both typical. So they're kind of serve as examples of many, many more that were displayed. All right, in this one, in the first issue of the magazine in December 1913, readers encountered a beautiful textual and visual spread of an 18th century country estate called Gomelskaya Estate. This particular layout includes pictures of both exterior and interior views, gardens, sitting rooms, and the accompanying text reveals this preoccupation with multiple temporal frames held at the same time. The authors highlight how, quote, because it is especially costly to preserve the estate for a long time, we must take a long view, like they say in our times, which for them meant fixing up the buildings and environs piecemeal, bit by bit, okay? So the past kind of haunts and defines the present. At Gomelskaya, quote, the soul of the landowner's whole past daily life resides still at the estate, even long after it was sold and some objects are discarded and some remain. The author of this Stolitsa article explains how even after the estate is sold and transformed, many wonderful and mysterious secrets are, in his words, archived in this place. The past that is housed on this estate included objects whose origins span centuries, one on top of the next, whether from the Palacido of the 16th century, the styles of the late 18th century, or newer items from the late 19th. These disparate objects represent multiple centuries and define the origins of this estate, including the residency of a Smolensk prince who occupied the grounds all the way in the 12th century. What follows is a lengthy description of the estate changing hands with the tides of history. In brief, it includes the Poles in the mid-17th century, the Litvaks in the 16th century, and many Russians in the era of Catherine the Great, who gave the lands to a hero in the Turkish wars, Field Master Pyotr Alexander Rumyantsev. He's responsible, this article tells us, for much of the interior transformation of the estate. And then when he dies, it goes on to explain how it's passed on to his brother, and so forth and so on. So this story, the ins and the outs and the transformations of domestic space through time, reverberates really in each issue. How am I doing? Because I have lots of examples. We're getting a few minutes. Okay, so one more brief example. So similar to the articles on this particular estate, there's another estate called McAuliffe's, which appeared in August 1916 issue, of course, amidst war. The reader encounters McAuliffe, an estate that, quote, came into being during the Petrine times. The historical roots of the estate and its importance are further established. At McAuliffe, we learn, until our day, this is a quote, there stands an oak tree that was planted in the days of Peter the Great. That oak tree is now the tallest of all the trees. And like the estate as a whole, the objects within it layer era upon era. There's also, we learn, quote, a gallery of portraits of many hetmen and those who have lived in the estate over centuries. There are art on domestic objects which betray the multiple temporalities represented in time. A candelabra from the Nikolaevan years, which sits near the stone-tiled oven in the style of Louis XVI, down the hall in the dining room. There's a wondrous chandelier from the Petrine times, and on and on. The author writes in this article, to quote, combining excellent first-class antiquities with modern comforts. That is the motto of McAuliffe. Finally, in the very self-consciousness with which the chroniclers of estate life transformed themselves into kind of amateur historians and archivists in order to tell the story of these particular estates, this impulse reflects this modern emphasis on the heterogeneity of time. In a 1916 issue, a journalist transforms himself into this amateur, self-consciously, an amateur kind of detective, as he excavates the textual and material remains of a Muscovite home on the verge of decay. As he learned more and more about the generations of the inhabitants and the objects within its interior, our journalist indicates, quote, "Many secrets are buried in this old home. Many strong feelings are aroused in one's soul when we see the rooms where the wealthy Barachka grew up over time." Barchatka. Within these rooms, our writer recreated a story about who lived in this mansion and how the inhabitants spent their days. So the early 20th century reader, surrounded by stories of bloodshed and uncertainty in wartime and in living in urban flux, dreamt of the luxuries and peacefulness of bygone days in the mansion where the Barachatka collected his vases, adorned the walls with family portraits, and admired his gardens. These references to home, to the past, to the emotions aroused by walking through the halls of former grandeur all reflect this nostalgic, often melancholy mood of the early 20th century. The past, with its nostalgic historical vistas, emerged and flourished in the present among representations of the spaces so familiar to us all, the home, its interior, and its grounds. And just one last by way of conclusion. In 1992, on the 70th anniversary of the founding of the Society for the Study of the Russian Estate, which strangely was founded in 1922, which I've yet to research, a group of scholars in 1992 gathered in Moscow to share their research on and ideas about the Russian estate. And one outgrowth of this now ongoing project is a catalog produced by the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1994, listing all of the estates featured in the early 20th century publications of estate life, including the one that I've read and described to you today. Okay, and I lost my place. And so in this 1994 edition, essentially we encounter a poem that was written earlier in the 20th century. And it highlights the centrality of ideas about the estate to the educated and likely elite public of the time. And just to quote from that poem, as if a legend I recall how I love that sweet and ancient white estate home. And this poem, with its place in late imperial and post-Soviet imaginings, reflects something of the role that estates and nostalgia within the creation of modern Russian historical consciousness at the fin de siècle. As peasants were picking up and searching for work in factories and gentry were receding, many educated Russians embraced this image of the pre-emancipation estate and seemed not to reflect that itself seemed not to reflect the harsh realities of serfdom itself, but the longing for a time of predictability and luxury. And the domestic, the manor house and its surrounding grounds, is the site for nostalgia's most potent articulation. Thank you.